Hello, I'm Vincent Drnevich, uh, and I'm inviting you to be with me in this presentation on professionalism and ethics in the practice of engineering. I am Professor Emeritus of Civil Engineering at Purdue University, which means that I've been a retired professor. I also serve on the State Board of Registration for Professional Engineers. I look forward to spending this time with you, sharing some ideas and concepts, and we ask you to stay with us. I will be on live, if you will, with for the first few slides, and then I will disappear and continue the presentation. As you can see here, I'm expressing my own views and opinions on all matters being discussed, and do not officially represent any of the entities listed on this slide. I'd like to acknowledge the people over the years that have helped me to develop my ideas and information concerning this presentation. Among those are Steve Gilman, Opal Kuehl, and Harold Sneed, who are colleagues on the State Board of Registration. You'll notice that there are 3 vacancies on the State Board, and I'll talk about that later. Next, I'd like to acknowledge Amy Hall. Amy is the director of the board, and she is with the Indiana Professional Licensing Agency. Others who are making this presentation possible and need to be acknowledged are Katie Winnett from NSPE Indiana as the Executive Director, David Kish, past President of NSPE Indiana, Chris Lopetsky, Indiana section of ASCE, and Sam Reed from NSPE Indiana. From this slide on, I'm going to not have my face shown. You'll hear me, and then I'll come back and you'll see me live again later in the presentation. Associated with this course is a quiz, and the quiz and evaluation sheet should have been sent to you after you registered for the course. If you wish, you may print it out and use it as we progress through the course. You're invited to complete the quiz as we progress, and then finally, after the course is over, submit the completed quiz and evaluation according to the instructions on the quiz sheet itself. That quiz sheet will be used to confirm your participation in the course, and the quiz will be graded with 70% or higher needed for passing and getting credit for the course. Here's an overview of what we'll be talking about today, and I'll give you a moment to look down through these topics. We'll be talking a lot more about reporting violations. Got some new exciting things on making evaluating decisions. In the Board of Ethical Review, there is related to that, the new ethics reference guide with an automated access video. Fantastic. We'll talk about ethical health fitness, and finally a summary and quiz and evaluation. Here are my expectations for this session. You can briefly scan down through them. This is the important one: systematic process for solving ethical dilemmas. Let's look at case 1. It's a conflict of interest between participating in multiple DOT proposals for different contractors. This comes from the NSPE BER case 17-8. That is 2017 and August. Facts: State's Department of Transportation is seeking a design-build contractor to pre-qualify for a specialized engineering construction project. Engineer A, who possesses unique expertise in this type of specialized engineering construction, has been contacted by 3 different competing design-build contractors for the project: Contractor X, Contractor Y, and Contractor Z, each of which will prepare a proposal for consideration by the DOT. The question: would it be ethical for Engineer A to participate with multiple design-build contractors in response to the DOT's RFP. Guess what? We're going to return to this later in the presentation. You can kind of think about it, and we'll go from there. Here's case 2. You've probably seen this one before, but we've got some new twists to it. We're talking about a young engineer employed by the State Transportation Department. He's in charge of inspecting a highway bridge project, which is being built by a private contractor. Work is being done strictly according to plans and specifications. It's quitting time on a hot summer Friday afternoon. The contractor comes to the site and offers a can of soda to each of his employees. He also offers you a can of soda. Can you ethically accept the can of soda? As you can guess, this can be escalated to a case of soda, a can of beer, a bottle of bourbon, a case of bourbon, pen with a company name on it, a hat and jacket with the company name and logo, a new car because of the thousands of dollars you have saved him, an offer from the contractor to pay the lunch bill for a lunch discussing the progress of the work, a ticket to a local charity golf tournament. These questions have been posed and to students in civil engineering and other branches of engineering for many, many years. And the questions are, what should the answer be to these questions? Well, they should be no to all questions. And the reason for that is the relationship of the engineer to the contractor. The engineer is representing the states, and the contractor is a private contractor. Let's look at how the students did. This is the summary from 1991 through the present time for mostly civil engineering students, but you can see there's some ag and biological engineering students. There's some graduate students involved in this as well. Along the axis is the time, the x-axis. The y-axis is the average percent no's. From the previous slide, we should have 100% no's for everybody. And you can see that as we go along, we're roughly just a little less than 60%. You can see as well that the black line is a least squares line, and it shows that fortunately the slope is positive, that the ethical behavior is increasing, and that's due predominantly to these courses. CE 524, a graduate course, 597, also a graduate course. Note also that in the first fall of 97, there's a spike which is quite different from the rest. It's an aberration. And the reason for that is I forgot to give the quiz out before I had an external speaker come in to talk about ethics. I gave it out in the following period, and you can see the effect that a person who talks about ethical behavior and engineering practice had on the students. And so the point to be made here is that we need to be talking about ethical behavior on a regular basis. If you look further to the right, in the spring of 2012, you'll see there was another outlier for sure. I checked with the instructor afterwards to make sure that this wasn't a mistake. And she told me that no, it's not a mistake. It didn't surprise her at all. She had 2 students in this class of 45 who were absolute hellions and did everything in their power to disrupt the class on every occasion. And this is the impact. And so we can see that bad apples do indeed spoil the barrel. And as you look off to the right, you can see that the graduate courses, students who have completed their undergraduate work and are now in graduate program, have a much more mature attitude towards the ethical behavior. And note there's a positive slope, so there's hope for the future. We can take a look at these data on each one of those cases, and we can see that 85% of people will accept the soda. Only 13% accept the bourbon, 10% the case of bourbon. Move on down, and you can see that the 13% will accept a new car. And you look at that, and these people will accept a new car over accepting a case of bourbon. A case of bourbon may cost a couple of $100, a new car $10,000, $20,000 or more. So more people would accept a new car than a case of bourbon. We'll now move on to looking at the basis for making ethical decisions. This is taken from Deborah Long's presentation, and she's quoting Lawrence Kohlberg's 6 stages. We're not going to cover all 6 here. You can kind of scan through from stage 1, obey, stage 2, self-interest, stage 3, peer pressure. And we're going to start with stage 4 and move on to 5 and 6. Stage 4, law and order. That being good means obeying the law and being a dutiful citizen. Why? To keep the system from falling apart. Most adults are stage 4 thinkers. It's the beginning of mature decision making, and stage 4 thinkers believe that it's the right thing to contributing to society, a group, or an institution. Take the point of view of the system that defines the rules and rules. And internalize society rules and expectations, particularly those of authorities. What are the limits of stage 4 thinking? Well, not all problems can be resolved using rules, laws, and codes of ethics. And we cannot anticipate all ethical dilemmas, particularly those created by technologies. There are limits. We put too much moral authority into legislation and thus are coerced to virtue. And of course, man-made laws can be gotten around. Stage 5, critically examine values. The rules of society are supposed to exist for all, but if the rules become destructive, or if one party doesn't live up to them, then the contract is no longer binding. Why? To keep my society from falling apart. Stage 6, universally accepted principles. These principles establish right from wrong. They are established by individual reflection and may even contradict laws. Why? Because my conscience tells me what to do. I like that word conscience. I think we all have one, and the question is, how do we use it and how is it formed? Never have been the stakes higher because we have large, complex systems, smart people. Some have missing ethical chips. This is an interesting Gallup poll result. It's a question of honesty and ethics in the professions as perceived by the public. Date of this is December 2019. As we look at the poll, we have a list of professions, top to bottom, and then they are ranked according to how they're perceived by the public. And the public has a chance to describe each of those professions as very high, high, average, low, very low, or no opinion. If you take a look at this listing, I think you'll see that engineers are number 2 on that list, following nurses, and just ahead of medical doctors. Isn't that nice? And how did engineers get on that list? Is by practicing ethical behavior, of being ethical in their engineering practice and dealing with the public and other engineers. You might want to scan down that list and look at some of the other professions. For example, if you go down to the bottom, you'll see car salespeople. Thank goodness for car salespeople. But look up 2 more. Senators and members of Congress are just above them. Our public opinion is not very high on those people. So let's talk about ethical behavior. It's a contract among affected parties, and it can be in 3 forms. 1, an unwritten understanding, so-called gentleman's agreement. It can be a written contract with a defined focus, and this is what we have with the professional codes of ethics. They're established and administered by a profession. And then finally we have the law, federal, state, and local statutes and rules, administered and enforced by officials, and there are fines and penalties that result. So the codes of ethics, these are established by the members of professional societies, and we have some examples here. We'll be talking in detail about the NSPE Code of Ethics. We'll talk briefly about ASCE, and by the way, as you can see here, ASCE is currently rewriting the entire Code of Ethics, and the update is available, or should be available, sometime in 2020. I've seen a draft of that, and it's quite different. The American Society of Mechanical Engineers, shown here, and a reference to it. And then finally, the NCEES Code of Ethics, with a link to it. The NCEES Code of Ethics, that's the National Council of Examiners for Engineering and Surveying, have a different approach, which we will briefly discuss as well. NSPE Code of Ethics, they start out with the fundamental canons, and these are essentially the heart of the Code of Ethics. Everything is contained here, and everything beyond that is are examples and explanations. So engineers in the fulfillment of their professional duties shall, number 1, hold paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public. This is typically the first and most important canon in all codes of ethics. 2, perform services only in areas of their competence. 3, issue public statements only in an objective and truthful manner. 4, act for each employer or client as faithful agents or trustees. 5, avoid deceptive acts. And 6, conduct themselves honorably, responsibly, ethically, and lawfully so as to enhance the honor, reputation, and usefulness of the profession. Let's take a look now at the rules of practice. These are, for each one of the canons, there is a rule of practice. So the canon number 1, engineers shall hold paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public. So there's an example. If engineer's judgment is overruled under circumstances that endanger life or property, they shall notify their employer or client and such other authority as may be appropriate. Engineers shall approve only those engineering documents that are in conformity with applicable standards. Of course, this means that the engineer must be aware of and conversant in the applicable standards, the most recent ones. Engineers shall not reveal facts, data, or information without the prior consent of the client or employer, except as authorized or required by law or this code. And there are 3 more examples. Rules of practice for the canon number 2, perform services only in areas of competence. Engineers shall undertake assignments only when qualified by education or experience in the specific technical fields. They shall not affix their signatures to any plans or documents dealing with subject matter in which they lack competence, nor to any plan or document not prepared under their direction and control. Big one. And C, engineers may accept assignments and assume responsibility for coordination of an entire project and sign and seal engineering documents for the entire project, provided that each technical segment is signed and sealed only by the qualified engineers who prepared the segment. I skipped 3 and 4. We'll go to 5. Engineers shall not be influenced in their professional duties by conflicting interests. Engineers shall not accept financial or other considerations, including free engineering designs from material equipment suppliers for specifying their product. Engineers shall not accept commissions or allowances directly or indirectly from contractors or other parties dealing with clients or employers of the engineer in connection with which work the engineer is responsible. Now we'll move on to professional obligations. And this is the part of the code that has to do with the establishing the behavior and relationship of the engineers to other engineers and the public. Engineers shall be guided in all their relations by the highest standards of honesty and integrity. Engineers shall acknowledge their errors and shall not distort or alter the facts. So engineers shall advise their clients or employers if they believe a project will not be successful. May not accept outside employment to the detriment of their regular work of interest, is something referred to as moonlighting. Before accepting any outside engineering employment, they will notify their employers. Engineers shall not attempt to attract an engineer from another employer by false or misleading pretenses. An engineer shall not promote their own interest at the expense and dignity and integrity of the profession. And finally, engineers shall treat all persons with dignity, respect, fairness, and without discrimination. This was added to the NSPE Code of Ethics in August of 2019. Mentioned earlier, the National Council of Examiners for Engineering and Surveying has a Code of Ethics. Here's the link to it. And it's part of the model rules. And you can see that they break these things out differently. They have licensee's obligation to the public and 10 rules associated with that. Licensee's obligation to the employer or clients, and licensee's obligation to other licensees. There are 4 rules. And these Code of Ethics are used in the FE and PE exams. So if you're going to be taking those exams, you need to look at the Code of Ethics as used by NCWS, and the link to it is given up above. Up to now, we've been talking about the Code of Ethics generated by professional and technical societies. We now turn to the law, in this case Indiana law and the practice of engineering. Indiana law is created by the legislature and is listed in Indiana codes. That's what the IC stands for. These are the relevant codes associated with engineering and the ethical practice in the professions and in engineering. They are also rules of the board, which are created by the members of the state boards. In this case, 864 IAC Rule 11 are the rules for the ethical behavior of licensed professional engineers in Indiana. So the Indiana law and the practice of engineering, as I said, was established by the legislature. It's implemented by rules established by the State Board of Registration. It goes by the Administrative Code number 864. And there are, in the code, the laws, compliance with professional standards, and this applies to all professions in Indiana. And 864 IAC Rule 11 applies to engineering practice by licensed engineers. So let's go and take a look a little deeper at the law. A practitioner shall comply with the standards established by the board regulating a profession. If a practitioner has engaged or knowingly engaged, cooperated, or in fraud or material deception in order to obtain a license to practice, including cheating on the licensing exam, engaged in fraud or material deception in the course of professional services and activities, advertised goods or services in a false or misleading manner, been convicted of a crime or assessed a civil penalty involving fraudulent building practices. And there are additional items within the Indiana Code. These are laws created by the legislature. Now we'll get down to the rules of the board. Rules are made by the board members. They are drafted with the help of board staff and counsel to the board. There are public hearings that have to occur before the rules can be put in place. The Office of Attorney General must approve the rules, and this to make sure that they are consistent with the Indiana Code, the laws of the state. There must be approval by the Office of Management and Budget so that the rule isn't overly expensive to implement or going to have some undue financial burden on the state or practitioners in the state. And finally, the governor's office has an opportunity to veto rules and rule changes. So we talked about Rule 11. This establishes requirements concerning ethical, economic, and legal principles. It is assumed that the engineer, the licensed engineer, is knowledgeable about the acts and rules of the board, and it's one of the reasons that we have this course. A licensed engineer agrees to abide by the act and rules. A licensed engineer understands that the practice of engineering is a privilege. And finally, in the Rule 11, the primary obligation is to protect the safety, health, and welfare of the public. Exactly the same as we saw in the Code of Ethics. And so there's quite a bit of similarity between the codes of ethics and what is in the law. As we continue, engineers perform assignments only when qualified by education and experience in a specific technical field. They shall not affix their seal or signature to any plan or document dealing with subject matter in which the engineer lacks competence. Engineers shall be completely objective and truthful in all professional reports, statements, or testimony. And there are additional items on this. But you can see again the parallel and consistency with the codes of conflicts of interest. An engineer must avoid conflicts of interest with employer or employee's clients. When unavoidable, disclose the circumstances to the engineer's employer or client. Compensating from more than one party for the same project. We're going to stop here for a second and ask the question, what about using the designs, specifications, etc. from previous project on another project? This is a big issue with computer automated design, drafting, and word processing. It's so easy to cut and paste from a previous project for which you've been compensated on a new project and save tremendous amount of time in the process and yet get compensated for it. According to this, that seems unethical. Think about it. Well, I know that everybody does it. And the question is it ethical? Well, there's two issues that we can address, two ways of looking at this. Number one, if you look at a previous design, the question is who owns that previous design? Do you, as the engineer, own that? Or does your previous client who paid for that design own it? I think you need to go back and take a look at the contract that you have with the previous client and see what is specified in that. In many cases, particularly for large organizations where there's repeat business, the organizations have in the contract that they own the designs, even though they were designed by an engineer. If that's the case, you cannot cut and paste from that previous design unless you get clearance from the owner of the project. In other cases, and perhaps most cases, the engineering firm who did the design is the owner of that information and then can cut from previous projects and paste as appropriate. So that's point number one. You must understand who is the owner and whether or not you have a right to do that. The second point is that once you insert in a new project something from another project, the engineer of record is totally responsible for all aspects of that as pasted in the new project. And if you're like me, when I do some cutting and pasting, there's some things in there that don't quite fit, or that some words that don't apply, or some calculations or constraints that will be different. And so the onus is on the engineer when you do things like this to be completely responsible for that effort. In some cases, it may be easier to design it from scratch. Okay, we'll talk about continuing conflicts of interest. Shall not accept, solicit, nor accept gratuities, directly or indirectly, from contractors, their agents, or other parties dealing with the engineer's client or employer in connection with work for which the engineer is responsible. The engineer shall not solicit or accept financial or other valuable considerations from material or equipment suppliers for specifying their product. Payment for consideration to secure work is prohibited. Exception is that the securing a salaried position through an employment agency. Engineers shall seek professional employment on a basis of qualification and competence in the proper accomplishments of similar work. Engineers shall not falsify or permit misrepresentation of the engineer or engineer's associates in academic or professional qualifications, and use of the name in fraudulent or dishonest ventures. Now let's see how good we are in terms of ethics. NSPE, the National Society of Professional Engineers, has an ethics exam, or 25 true-false questions to hone your skills. The link to that is shown here. And then they have another link which they have answers to check your ethical sharpness, and they give an explanation of why the answers are such. We're going to take a look at one of them. This happens to be question number 24. Engineers shall not offer to give, nor receive, either directly or indirectly, any contribution to influence the award of a contract by a public authority, or which may be reasonably construed by the public as having the effect or intent of influencing the award of a contract unless such contribution is made in accordance with applicable federal, state, election campaign finance laws and regulations. Is this true or false? Well, the answer is false. Why? Well, if we go back to the NSP Code of Ethics, you can read through that and you can see that it's basically the same as listed above, except there is no unless such contribution is made in accordance with applicable federal or state election campaign finance laws and regulations. That is not listed in the Code of Ethics. And for comparison, we can go now to the state rules, the Indiana rules. Engineers shall not offer to pay, either directly or indirectly, any commission, political contribution, gift, or other consideration in order to secure work exclusive of securing a salaried position through an employment agency. So we see here that question number 24 is indeed false. So the story now is that when anyone, and I particularly point this out to students entering the workforce, when you first go and get a job, find out early what the policy is with your company or agency. And then keep in mind as a professional, you're an agent for the owner of the state, the contractor, company, etc. And be aware that the appearance of impropriety can cause the same damage as doing it. And one of my favorites is that there's no such thing as a free lunch. Okay, now we're going to move on to reporting violations. We're going to look at that first in terms of Indiana, then we're going to look at it in a larger scale. The Indiana law requires the investigation and prosecution of complaints concerning regulated occupations, of which engineering is one. And in Indiana, the Attorney General is the one responsible for this chapter, and they may receive, investigate, and prosecute complaints concerning related occupations. And all complaints must be written and signed by the complainant and initially filed with the director, except for employees of the Attorney General's office acting in their official capacity. The complaint may be filed by any person, including members of any of the boards listed in section 1 of this chapter. And there's a link to it right there. I want to point out that Indiana is different from many other states. In many other states, the complaints are submitted to the State Board of Registration, and that state board then has the responsibility for investigating these complaints and taking action on them. In Indiana, the complaint is made to the Attorney General's office. The Attorney General's office investigates the complaints, but they do not take action on them. Any complaint that is substantive, the Attorney General's office will bring that complaint to the State Board of Registration, and the State Board of Registration conducts hearings and then takes action on those complaints. So it's different in the state of Indiana. I happen to like the Indiana situation better. It takes the onus from the board to do the investigation and allows the staff in the Attorney General's office to do the investigation. And by the way, the staff of the Attorney General's office reports to the board at every meeting on the status of the investigations, and we have a member of the Attorney General's office as a liaison to the board who is with the board at all the meetings. What about reporting violations in other states? Well, you can go to this link and you can find out where you can apply complaints. You can take a look and you can see that there are a number of different sites to go through. I put these here so that you can, if you're ever in a situation where you need to get that information, this would be a location where you can start to find that information. Now, if you're concerned about federal agencies, you can go to this site and look at the federal agencies and get information there. If you go to that site, you'll be overwhelmed. There are 400 or more agencies listed on that site, and so it's a tremendous maze to get into and find something on that site. And if you're unable to resolve an issue with the federal government agency, you can contact the Office of the Inspector General of that agency, and there's a link, which is a hotline. Now, recognizing ethical problems. Well, we have an ethical problem when we have that feeling in the pit of our stomach, and all of us have had that. We start rationalizing about a decision and use phrases like, everybody does it, oh, it's not that important, or that could hurt his or her feelings. That statement is one that causes students to be unethical. They're concerned about hurting other people's feelings. Now, we're engineers and we like to solve things in a systematic fashion. And so what we are going to do is to look at ethical thinking as an organized, reasoned analysis of value-laden problems. And how do we solve those in a systematic fashion? Well, this is something that was generated by my class in October the 29th, 1998. It's a list that turned out to be fairly tried and true. And the first thing we have to do is realize that we have a problem. Some of us are sometimes so dense or oblivious to what's going on that we don't realize that we have a problem. The next thing is to define the problem, as we do it in an engineering problem for doing a field investigation or site investigation. We look at all the conditions and factors, who the stakeholders are, what, when, where, why, what evidence exists. And so that's to define a problem. It's much easier to solve a problem if it's defined. Number 3, look at the options available, all possible solutions. And I mean all possible solutions to the problem. It'd be surprising you how many solutions there are available. Number 4, weigh the consequences. That is the pros and cons of each one of the available solutions. There are options that you picked in step 3 above. Number 5, compare it to others. And in this case, the Code of Ethics is a good example. I've got a link here that takes you to a 8-minute video that shows how to use the Code of Ethics in a very effective fashion to find solutions or examples of the problems that you're having. Number 6, compare it to the law. And we've just finished talking about the Indiana Code and Rule 11 in the rules of the board. And so we can go back to those and see what is said in the law. And I think you'll find that the law and the codes are pretty similar on this. An important one, does it feel right? The New York Times rule or the Indianapolis Star rule. What does your gut tell you? The golden rule. And that's pretty important. Number 8, ask someone else. This is one that the students had a difficult time coming up with when we first generated it. And finally, there was one student in the back of the room who said to me, well, when I get into a problem like that, I go ask my mom. And I said, you know what, you've got it. The question is, ask someone else. You as an engineer ought to have sufficiently good working relationships with your colleagues at work, with colleagues in professional and technical societies, that you can ask them for their ideas on the dilemma that you're wrestling with. Number 1, they are not directly concerned, and as a consequence may be able to give you a more level-headed response. They also will be able to give you some ideas perhaps that you hadn't thought about. And so this is a very important component of it. So don't be afraid to ask someone else, people that you can trust. Number 9, choose what to do. So you have all the information up to this point in time, and you need to choose based on what's best. But it's no good unless you act on it. And so you need to put into practice what you've decided to do. Then finally, learn from the experience. Now there are details of these steps on pages 5 and 6 of the NSPE Ethics Reference Guide. The source of that information is this list, and it was embellished by the Board of Ethical Review. Oh, the Board of Ethical Review. This is a panel of engineering ethics experts that has served the profession's guide through ethical dilemmas since 1954. And so each month the board comes up with a example, and those are available to and are published. The board consists of 7 licensed members who are appointed by the NSPE president. I'm completing my second and final term on that board. The purpose of the BER is to render impartial opinions containing interpretation of the Code of Ethics. We also develop materials and conduct studies relating to the ethics of the engineering profession. And there's a new 8-minute instructional video that allows for quick and easy access to relevant codes in the NSPE Code of Ethics and hundreds of BER cases. And I would strongly recommend that you watch that video. And then if you encounter an ethical dilemma, start with that video. You'll find examples of very similar to the predicament that you're in, and this will give you guidance. The members of the Board of Ethical Review apply these following steps. They first of all list the facts. They compare to the others, and this is to the NSPE Code of Ethics and the previous Board of Ethical Review cases. They have a detailed discussion of the situation, and then they provide a conclusion. Now let's return to case number 1. Recall this was a conflict of interest participating in multiple DOT proposals. I think I don't need to read the facts. The question is, would it be ethical for engineer A to participate with multiple design build contractors in response to the DOT's RFP? Let's see how this is handled. First of all, the Board of Ethical Review went through and looked at the relevant NSPE codes of ethics, and here are the references. There happen to be 5 of them. One of them, engineers shall undertake assignments only when qualified by education or experience in specific technical fields. You can scan down through those. I don't need to read them all. Item 3.4, engineers shall not disclose without consent confidential information concerning the business affairs or technical processes of any present or former client or employer or public body on which they serve. And then there are 3 BER case references. 95-1 was January 1995, 2002-12, and 2005-10. And you can again see this video on how those cases can be searched out by using this YouTube video. In this case, the contracting parties are in direct ongoing competition with one another for an assignment. Engineer A's participation with more than one contractor could raise conflict of interest. if engineer A would be privy to proprietary information that could be influenced or appear to influence engineer A and potentially compromise engineer A's judgment in decisions. Engineer A may be called upon to make as well as a rendering of engineer A's services. Engineer A should disclose to each contractor that he is participating in other RFPs and protect all confidential information shared with him during the qualification process. So this is a part of the discussion that took place. The conclusion: it would be ethical for engineer A to participate with multiple design build contractors in response to the DOT's pre-qualifying RFP because the award will go to only one of the three contractors. Engineer A will perform work only for the contractor that wins the award. Here's the NSPE reference guide to BER cases and the link to it, which is a PDF file. It can be easily downloaded. And on this slide, you're seeing the table of contents of what is contained in that code. Here's a subject reference to the NSPE Code of Ethics. This is only one of many pages with the information on the left-hand side and the relevant codes given on the right. Let's face it, ethical decisions are tough. They're not always black and white, and most often shades of gray. Importantly, personal loyalties and feelings are typically involved. We may encounter no-win situations, damned if we do and damned if we don't. Our job or livelihood is at stake, could be at stake, and I've seen many examples of that in the past. We could have conflicting guidelines, hopefully not, but nonetheless we need to sort those out. And other reasons that make this decision-making a very difficult situation. So, how do we get around this? Well, first of all, have a balance of physical, emotional, social, intellectual, economic, and spiritual health. Part of that is taking courses like this and reading on the subject matter so that we keep ourselves in good physical and emotional shape. We take time to sharpen the saw through study and reflection, continuing education, etc. Don't look at continuing education as something onerous that we have to do in order to renew our license, but look at continuing education and reflection and study as an opportunity to enhance our abilities and skills. Take time to discuss issues with other professionals, and that is the value of participating in professional and technical organizations where you have contact with other professionals. Come to conferences such as the one you're coming to here. And finally, consistency of behavior in all things, small as well as big. In summary, ethical behavior benefits everyone. Ethical behavior may be unwritten agreements, codes, and statutes and rules. Upon renewal of your PE license, the person acknowledges familiarity with the laws and rules and agrees to abide by them. Engineers must be aware of agency and company policies concerning gifts. Codes of ethics are essential for professionals. Professional and technical societies and professional licensing laws and rules determine the ethical practice of engineering. Use a systematic approach to resolving value-laden problems. The Board of Ethical Review gives examples of many ethical problems. And stay ethically fit. Here are lists of ethics references. The ones highlighted in yellow are the reference to the NSPE and the video which I talked about earlier. At the bottom of this slide, I give reference to a paper on 5 ethical gray areas in civil engineering. It's a very, very easy to read, worthwhile paper, and gives examples. Then I would highly recommend that you can go to that reference. Well, here we are. We made it, and I thank you for your attention, for hanging with me as we've gone through these course. I know you may have questions or comments that you'd like to make. You can send those to me at the email shown here. If this presentation is part of a conference that everyone is participating in simultaneously, you may be able to use the chat feature to provide questions, and responses will be given to you as soon as possible. Again, I thank you for your participation. I hope you found this useful and valuable, and I look forward to participating with you again in the future. And be sure to submit your quiz and evaluation sheets. Failure to do so will result in not getting credit for this course. Instructions for submitting those should be on the sheets themselves, and this will depend on when you're taking this course and who is the sponsor of it. Well, this completes the course on ethics and professionalism. Thank you for your attention. Look forward to serving you in the future, and please contact me with any questions or suggestions you might have. Thank you. Have a good day.